Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's forum, Measure 110, Problems and Solutions. My name is Eric Zimmerman. I'm a resident of Southwest Portland. I'm also the Chief of Staff to Multnomah County Commissioner Julia Brim Edwards. I'm going to be moderating today's forum and some of the question and answer segments of the forum. But I also want to just first say a thank you to the sponsors of this forum. First off, Neighbors West and Northwest, the Downtown Neighborhood Association, the Pearl District Neighborhood Association, Old Town Community Association, the Goose Hollow Foothills League, the Northwest District Association, Southwest Hills Residential League, and Revitalize Portland Coalition. Today for our panelists, we have State Representative Rob Noose, we have Sergeant Aaron Schmatz, Mike Marshall, who is the co-founder of and a director of Oregon Recovers. Paige Richardson will be joining us from a fixed ballot Measure 110 coalition, and Keith Wilson, the founder and chair of the Shelter Portland, and also the president and CEO of Titan Freight Systems. For our panelists, I just want to say thank you. It's been a lot of preparation and you're putting in your time, so I really appreciate you dedicating a couple hours with us. And a huge thank you to Neighbors West and Northwest for producing today's program. Well done, Carl and Darlene. They're very much appreciated. I know for me, you guys have been holding the hand all week and last week, and I appreciate that. I want to turn it over to Vadim Mozyrsky. He's the president of the Goose Hollow Foothills League, and ask you, Vadim, can you introduce a little bit more about each of our panelists and give us some opening remarks?
Thank you very much, Eric, and I second your appreciation to Darlene and Carl for putting this all together. I also want to thank everybody that is participating online. You really are making this event special and important by spreading the word about this important topic. Neighbors West Northwest, for those that may not know, supports our neighborhood associations, which are comprised of diverse individuals who volunteer their time to help residents and visitors of their respective communities. Research shows that while people's participation in most types of voluntary organizations is beneficial for the quality of democratic government, neighborhood associations have a particularly positive influence on the functioning of political and economic institutions. Neighborhood associations act as a school of democracy in which the community is socialized into activism and political participation. They facilitate communication between various individuals and institutions and stimulate articulation of residents' interests and expectations. They contribute to the emergence of a sense of community among local residents. They increase individuals' and communities' civic capacity. As a result, neighborhood associations contribute to the empowerment of communities and lay the groundwork for local policy efforts. In keeping with these broad themes, this is the third in a series of forums to educate the public on important topics of the day. Amplify the voices of Portland residents seeking solutions to common needs, ensure communication and coordination with local and statewide policymakers, and perhaps most important, empower people to advocate for their needs. In April, we held a forum bringing together the mayor, county chair, and other officials to improve how we work together to end unsheltered homelessness. In September, we held a behavioral health forum with city, county, and state officials seeking solutions to Portland's drug and behavioral health crises. Today, we follow up with a discussion about Measure 110 in the context of recent polls showing widespread disillusion about the effectiveness and unintended consequences of removing legal penalties for illicit drug possession. We have assembled a distinguished panel representing diverse views on the topic. You may have read in the press recently that several of our panelists traveled to Portugal to understand what lessons can be learned from that country's drug decriminalization efforts. Amid claims for repeal of Measure 110, the state legislature formed the Joint Interim Committee on Addiction and Community Safety Response, and many of our panelists have testified on how to improve the process of getting people from crisis into treatment. The legislature is expected to consider policy changes to Measure 110 as early as this February, so the timing of this forum for any future advocacy is particularly relevant. So let me introduce our panelists in a little bit more depth. First, we have Representative Rob Noose, who is the state representative for House District 42 in Inner Southeast and Northeast Portland since 2014. Representative Noose is the chair of the Behavioral Health and Healthcare Committee. We also have Sergeant Aaron Schmatz, Sergeant Schmotz is the president of the Portland Police Association. And he is also the president of an organization comprising of both the police association as well as the sheriffs. We next have Mike Marshall, who's the co-founder and executive director of Oregon Recovers, the statewide movement of people in recovery working to end Oregon's addiction crisis. He brings more than 30 years of political campaign, civic engagement, and advocacy experience to this role. Mike lives in Irvington and has been in recovery from addiction to alcohol and methamphetamines for over 15 years. Oregon Recovers recently issued an emergency 12-step plan to end the addiction crisis and was the leading voice of opposition to Measure 110 in 2020. Paige Richardson is a member of the Fixed Ballot Measure 110 Coalition, which seeks to fulfill the promise of Measure 110. More treatment, more quickly, to more people. By fixing Measure 110, either through a ballot initiative or legislative action. Keith Wilson is president and CEO of Titan Freight Systems and the chair of Shelter Portland, a nonprofit with the mission of ending unsheltered homelessness in Portland. Keith has traveled extensively researching solutions to end unsheltered homelessness, which includes meeting with officials in the Netherlands and Portugal, the only other drug decriminalization jurisdictions in the world besides Oregon. We expected Monta Knudsen, the CEO of Bridges of Change, to be here today, but unfortunately, Monta is under the weather today and unable to attend. Our panelists will hold a conversation based on questions submitted beforehand by you, our Zoom audience, and moderated by Eric Zimmerman. So Eric, back to you.
Thank you, Vadim. It's really great, everybody. Seeing this group of panelists I think this will be a good conversation. And to all the neighbors who've submitted questions, very appreciative. You know, it takes time to think through, and some of the questions that came through are really thoughtful, not reactionary, but very much want to get into information. And I think that's our goal for today, is having a solid conversation. I'm going to just ask now that each of our panelists maybe take 2 to 3 minutes and to describe why you're here today and what has gotten you involved with either Measure 110 or why people think of you when it comes to a panel, and why your work or your involvement has gotten you involved here. It doesn't need to be comprehensive, because we are going to then go into some questions and dive more deeply into some details, but kind of give us the wave top about you and why you're here. And I'd like to start with Representative Rob Noss, if we could.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so in 2020, during the short legislative session, House Speaker Kotek made me the vice chair of the newly created Behavioral Health Committee in the Oregon legislature. And then in 2021, at the height of the pandemic, the speaker said to me, Representative Sanchez is going to pass a bunch of bills in her committee to deal with behavioral health and the challenges we're having in that space. And you're on the Ways and Means Subcommittee for Human Services and Healthcare, and you're going to make sure they get all funded. And I was like, okay. So I was lucky to have a partner in Senator Kate Lieber, who knew a lot about our mental health system because of her time on the Psychiatric Review Board and her journey in understanding the state hospital. And the two of us swung, if you include ballot measure 110 monies, because I tend to, $1.3 billion toward mental health and behavioral health services in the state. It was the largest investment probably since the 90s that we've made in that space. So it's my policy role. I'm the chair of the Behavioral Health and Healthcare Committee. Ballot measure 110 has sort of been in my jurisdiction. I worked on a bill in the 23 session, 2513, House Bill 2513, to improve its operations. And then after we got done with the short session in June, starting in the middle of July, there was one national news article after another about this topic. So here we are. So I'm a member of the committee in the legislature that is dealing with this. It's now not just in the behavioral health space. We have a joint House, Senate that's bringing law enforcement types and addiction and healthcare types in the legislature together. That's our Addictions and Community Safety Committee. And we are absolutely going to be taking up changes to this ballot measure and to our addiction and our criminal justice system in the addiction space for sure in the February session 2024.
Thank you, Representative. I appreciate that. That's more than just a committee when you put it that way. There's a lot going on that brings things to fruition once things get passed. So thank you.
Ballot measure 110 all the time for me, Eric, all the time right now.
Yeah, exactly. Let's move over to, I'm going to go to Keith Wilson. Keith, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your involvement and your thoughts.
There you go. Thank you, Eric. Thank you to the Neighbors West Coalition as well, Darlene, and to the fellow panelists. Great to be here. My name is Keith Wilson, and I am founder and chair of a group called Shelter Portland. So really been following this crisis for this last 6 years, and a group of local and national leaders. A lot of them worked for the federal government and mayors and executive directors of counties continuum of care who have ended unsheltered homelessness have really gotten together with me to really focus on a programmatic approach on how are we going to end unsheltered homelessness in Portland using best practices from around the nation and the world. In so doing, we've got about 20 shelters that we have designed to set up. We've got 2 that are open with a 3rd being sited right now. And while sheltering our unsheltered is one of those critical facets, it's also important we address the inflow. And why did someone become unsheltered in the first place? So ending unsheltered homelessness, in and of itself is a very important process, but it's also the inflow. So to address the inflow, we have to address housing affordability, the behavioral health crisis, and then the addiction crisis. How did somebody end there? And the only way we stop that inflow is addressing those issues. So that's really what has brought us to the Measure 110, focusing on drug decriminalization. For us to understand that inflow, I had to understand how are we going to help those that are addicted get treatment, and then certainly how do we help move them not into the criminal system, but into the treatment system. Our Measure 110 was modeled off of Portugal, and there's only 2 drug decriminalization jurisdictions in the world. And so I spent a week in Portugal in June, and then I've spent 2 trips in the Netherlands, the most recent 2 weeks ago, to understand why aren't they afflicted with the same open drug use crisis where overdoses are occurring on the street. You walk or drive through downtown Portland, and you can see the humanitarian crisis before us. So we have to understand that reasoning. How did we arrive at our crisis today? And now how do we fix it based on those best practices that we've gained from around the world? So thank you, Eric, for that opportunity.
Thanks, Keith. That's great. You've traveled quite a bit to learn and to get information to bring back. So I hope it'll be helpful in today's conversation. I'm going to move next to Paige Richardson, actually. Paige, it's good to see you. It's been a while.
Good to see you as well. Thank you.
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Why don't you share with folks for a couple minutes and what's bringing you to this? We know that you're part of a campaign, but tell us more about what's driving that.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that's driving it for me is it's super personal. I have been in Oregon for 30 years, but I was born and raised in West Virginia. And West Virginia now leads the nation in overdose rates and deaths. And that people largely outside of Appalachia don't really understand the dynamics in those places. But it's not simply because those folks have had fewer economic and educational opportunities. There was a concerted, effort that finally some of those folks were convicted to bring more drugs, to overprescribe, and then cartels came in and followed that demand. And that's West Virginia's probably 6-7 years ahead of where Oregon is. People tend to think if they're not from Appalachia that you can never become one of those places, but I just don't think that's true. And so I became alarmed several years ago when I started seeing the rates increasing here and not enough alarm and urgency. And then when Measure 10 was passed, I was for decriminalization because the things we've been doing previously to combat drugs definitely not working. And certainly we had been underinvesting in treatment dollars for decades here. So that was a good move. What I didn't understand, and I think a lot of those that voted for 110 didn't understand, is that in a lot of ways it was set up for failure. Most of us had no idea that there was a 90-day implementation period. So when at a time when we were 49th in the nation for availability of treatment and recovery services. Most of us had no idea that it would apply to children, to young people, not just to adults who use these substances, but for kids as well. Those of us who are like lead with our heart and are trying to make our communities and systems better, we often think about how to help the people who are struggling now. We often don't think about in the world of drugs and the use of drugs and the sellers and what the message you're sending is. And this is what I knew from my experience with friends and family in West Virginia is we put an open sign on Oregon for drug trafficking. And so we've had an increase in cartel activity, criminal activity. And those organizations are very smart and very nimble, and they are without conscience or boundaries at all. And so they will not let up. That was an unintended consequence, an unanticipated challenge. Most people didn't see fentanyl coming, right? Including, I think, the writers of 110. And then finally, whoever wrote 110 either wasn't considering our lack of treatment availability or they just ignored it. And as a reminder, I'm not blaming anybody who voted for it, like me, or even the folks who fought for it here on the ground, but the Drug Policy Alliance treated Oregon as their experimental ground. And the first goal of theirs was simply decriminalization. Treatment was added to the measure because not enough voters would support decriminalization alone. And so it wasn't fully baked. This is a cautionary tale on passing complex policy by ballot measure, right? It's really hard to do. So that's what drives me here today and to this work, is because we need to make some adjustments, fix and improve. We put both those words in there, not because they're pithy and memorable, but because there are good things of Measure 110. The funding is critical. Getting more funding and a dedicated funding stream, so important. Calling out treatment, recovery, peer support programs, all those things are good, but we took away prevention, and there are many of our prevention tools and enforcement tools, right? So the 4 pillars of good drug policy are prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and enforcement. We need to have all 4 of those. So I'll stop there and thank you.
Thanks, Paige. I've known you a long time, and I don't think I realized the West Virginia connection actually. So thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
And next I'd like to go to Aaron, if you want to give a couple of minutes about your involvement and why you're here.
Sure. Aaron Schmautz. I'm a police sergeant here in Portland. I'm second generation. I grew up in Northeast Portland over by the Rose City Golf Course. I'm currently the president of the Portland Police Association, and I represent all of our kind of frontline officers, sergeants, criminalists, detectives, dispatchers, and PS3s. I was elected to my position in 2021, which really was kind of at the turning point for law enforcement in our country and here in our city. And you know, the real interesting thing for me as I analyzed coming into this position and what my role, what I felt it should be, you know, law enforcement for a long time has lived in the world of unintended consequences. Very often when we're discussing policy or, you know, what we're going to do to navigate public safety, we've not really been at the table. And, you know, we could debate whether or not it's because we were allowed or we just weren't asking well enough. The real challenge becomes police necessarily have more touch points with people who are suffering from addiction, people who are suffering from mental health issues, people who are suffering from homelessness than any other service provider in the world. Daily, our officers are out interacting with people who are struggling. And the real frustration is while we are not the justice system writ large, we are the first cog in that wheel. And when people call law enforcement, they're asking for solutions. And anytime you have a police call for service, you have 2 impacted people. Very often, many of them, both of them, one of them is suffering from these things I've just mentioned. But the challenge becomes, how do we ensure that we resolve and restore, which is kind of our mandate, but also ensure that we're getting help to the person who's being called about as well. And so one thing that really broke down with a lot of these things, including with Measure 110, was the mandate through Measure 110 in a lot of ways was that we want to take law enforcement's touch points and separate them a bit. We want to get people out of the justice system into services. But we also said, well, the vehicle for that, the vector for that is going to be through citations from law enforcement. And so we kind of pulled back and then shoved it right back in without any real connection to how those services would be manifested. And what I've really wanted to do over the last couple of years is learn how we can be a better partner. I've been allowed and really graciously allowed to sit at a lot of tables with people who have a lot of historical distrust with law enforcement, who are concerned about law enforcement's role in our community. And I feel like through those interactions, we've really been able to start to realize that we're dealing with the same issues, just through a different lens. My goal through the work that I'm doing and meeting with all y'all on the panel today and meeting with community members and meeting with different groups is to kind of actualize kind of the dream that Measure 110 was, by understanding that involving law enforcement in the discussion and ensuring that we can actually do what we're asked to do well really is the pathway forward. The best example I can give, and it actually just in a timely way happened yesterday, for the first time that I'm aware of, we had police officers working in downtown Portland, but they had addiction specialists available to them. And so when something would happen, they would find someone who's struggling. They got their citation, but they were able to say, hey, do you want help right now? Because when you think about the merry-go-round of addiction, you're going to pass windows where you may be able and ready to ask for help. But if the help is not there right now, you're not going to be ready until that next time. And we don't know when that next time is coming. It's the same thing with people who are suffering from mental health issues and other things. When you are clear of mind and you're ready and you want help right now, the odds of there being a police officer standing in front of you are very high. But police need to be able to both abate the problem, but also be able to hand those folks off to people who can actually do that aftercare. So again, we have acute and we have chronic. Police officers aren't well suited to deal with chronic issues, but we sure have an awful lot of touch points to be that kind of warm handoff. So again, here to look for partnership, here to kind of help excuse some of the concerns that people have law enforcement. Our officers here in Portland are wonderful human beings, and they are just that. They're human beings. And they're looking for ways to do what we're asking them to do, which is resolve these problems that are acute, but also have people to call in real time to hand these problems off. And so I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that. And then we're going to move to Mike Marshall, the co-founder of Oregon Recovers. Mike, do you want to share a couple of minutes about your involvement and why you're here today?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And thanks, Vadim and the whole team who put this together. These are exactly the sort of conversations we need to be having. I'm here today for several reasons Vadim cited when introducing me. Number one, I live in Portland. I'm an Oregonian and really care about the state and this city. Number two, I'm a person long-term recovery. At the end of January, I'll celebrate 16 years, God willing, of continuous sobriety. So I know what it is to put a needle in your arm. I know what it is to wake up from a blackout drunk. I know what it is to struggle to decide to get help, and then what it is to struggle to get help. And then I know what the daily struggle is like to stay in recovery. I still go to meetings. I still talk to people about my addiction. It is ever present. It truly is one day at a time. And so, and 7 years ago, in the course of the Oregonian did a 4-part series on how poorly Oregon dealt with the addiction crisis. Then we consistently ranked last in access to treatment. And back then we had the 5th highest addiction rate. Today we have the 2nd highest addiction rate. And so I think context really matters for folks here. There's an awful lot of discussion of how do we use Measure 1, how do we fix Measure 110 and help the people on the street, which is hugely important. However, bear in mind that 18% of Oregonians have a substance use disorder, according to the federal government. 2/3 of them are addicted to alcohol. Alcohol is the big driving force behind Oregon's addiction crisis. So that's about 700,000 people. Comparatively, I think we have 18,000 homeless in the entire state. So it's important that we come up with solutions that meet everybody, but also are as broad and as significant and meet the moment as we need to. We are in a crisis. And so Oregon Recovers was launched 7 years ago to focus on building the political capital by bringing people in recovery together with their friends and loved ones, and also, as I like to say, a coalition of people in recovery, the people who love them and the people who take care of them, which is also everyone who works in the treatment centers, and from the CEO down to the peer mentors. And so we've been working, consistently, particularly with Representative Sanchez in the legislature, about getting a strategic plan developed, which was delivered to the governor in 2020. That I will point out, the Drug Policy Alliance, to Paige's point, they, as that strategic planning process was going on, they were qualifying Measure 110, and they refused to participate in the stakeholder engagement relative to developing a statewide plan. They were not interested in addressing Oregon's addiction crisis. And so we'll get into it later, but Oregon Recovers, ultimately, after trying to talk the Drug Policy Alliance and getting them to amend the initiative, and then to consider campaigning on it differently and being more honest about it, so that we voters did not buy something and then find out it was something completely different, which is exactly what happened. And so we ultimately opposed it. But not because we don't support decriminalization. Decriminalization is hugely important. Criminalizing people for their addiction is just wrong. It's not productive. The problem is it put the cart before the horse. It disassembled one system of engagement, the criminal justice system, completely imperfect. And really the problem was there, not that we relied on the criminal justice system, it's that we only relied on the criminal justice system. We don't have another form of engagement. Measure 110 was designed to fund organizations that could do that engagement. But to Paige's point, decriminalization happened, February 1st of 2021. The money to go build that system, largely because Governor Brown and her team were really inept at implementing it, that didn't go out until 2022. So of course it was not a success coming right out. There are really great things, we can talk about that here, that Measure 110 does. It's, it passed with a wide majority. We need to recognize that it's doing some really good things. And to Paige's point, we need to amend it, not end it. Oregon Recovers disagrees with the ballot measure right now that Paige and her colleagues are promoting, not because we don't get the intent of it, but because we think that the solution needs to be more nuanced. In fact, if people go to OregonRecovers.org, they can see our emergency 12-step plan to end the addiction crisis, which talks about changes to Measure 110, but also the scope and breadth of the issues that we need to deal with. Namely, we need to fund residential treatment, residential detox. We need to create a new level of care that we can call stabilization, respite, whatever. Most importantly, this state has got to begin investing in prevention. Measure 110 didn't do any of those things.
Yep.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. I want to, just for the benefit of our viewers and for everybody, Vadim had mentioned that Monta Knudsen from Bridges to Change was going to be a part of this, and we're really sad that she is not feeling well and was not able to join. But I think it's important for everybody, this panel, and any viewers of this, to know that Monta has, I think, an opinion that I don't want to speak for her, but we wanted to be part of this conversation that would kind of round out. I think what you'll gather from the perspectives that have just shared is that it's a variety of some people who are deeply involved in getting treatment out there into the community, others who are working on some fixes, others who are kind of feeling some difficulty. It's a bit mixed, and it's not designed to be a for and an against conversation. It's really designed to be about the nuances that go into what Measure 110 was intended to do, what it is doing, and because there is a conversation about potential fixes. So I just want to say that for our panel and for the good of our audience too, is that we are missing one voice there, and we wish that she could be with us. But with that, I do want to, we're going to move into some questions and answers. And the panelists, what I've asked of them is, generally this is not intended to be a debate, right? We're not putting 110 on the ballot tomorrow to say, please vote this way or vote that way. This is more about information. And so there may be some different opinions. And for panelists, what I'd ask is that we allow each other to kind of complete the thought. And if there's a point that you really want to make in response to somebody's thoughts, just make yourself known, speak up, and that'll be okay. And if it gets too many, then I'll kind of dictate where we go next on who. But generally, we'll just kind of go through, and I'll lead us on. And I'm going to start. Here's the preparatory. I'm going to start with Representative Noss. And Rob, can you share what about Measure 110 has gone as intended? And from your position particularly, what's missed the mark in terms of implementation so far?
Well, hindsight's always 2020, and I think if I had to do it all over again, we would have stood up all of the treatment and supports in the 36 counties and the behavioral health resource networks first. And, when I was in this last legislative session, I focused on all of the challenges we had around implementation of that part of the measure. And, again, hindsight being 2020, I wasn't surprised that the implementation of a brand new program in 36 counties, organizational supports that we never had available for, was messy, and the meetings were tedious or a lot of arguing. I just think that's how humans coming together to make a big project work. That's how we are sometimes. So I would have stood that up first. I think we should have done a better job of anticipating meth and fentanyl. I don't think it was as prevalent in our community back in 2020 when this measure passed. And had it been more prevalent, I think that would have caused for a lot of challenge for the passage of the ballot measure, just to be honest with you. And I think there's different people that we could contact that would say that we knew this was coming, but I don't think that it was generally known here in Oregon that there's this way more addictive methamphetamine that makes you psychotic, as opposed to being the party drug based on ephedrine that was here in the last decade, was coming. And I don't think that we anticipated that it was going to be laced with a very addictive opioid. And so you get people addicted to both things. So that's the first thing. And then I think if we had stood up the behavioral health supports and the organizations and the treatment programs, I think then we would have said, okay, and at this point, we're pulling the decrim part, and we'll start that and see how it goes. So that's sort of my hindsight 2020 that I would sort of say.
We would agree with him at Fix and Improve. Really, if it had been flipped, we'd be in a really different situation. We wouldn't be here. Maybe we would have some disagreements on some things. Certainly, I wouldn't be sitting here. In our group, I hold down the left. So, but I thank you, Rob, for saying that, Representative, for saying that. I think that was an important, piece that we can't go back and change. We are
Yes.
where we are now.
We are where we are. And so
Yeah.
the thing that I'm struggling with is, so for me, what I worry about most is I think the legislature is going to have to figure out if it makes sense to make it a misdemeanor to use in public and a misdemeanor to possess. Okay. And I would say right now, we're deep in the throes of trying to figure that out. Okay. So for your listeners, we don't just show up to the February legislative session, or for that matter, the one that starts in January of the odd numbered year, all ready to go. There's tremendous preparation and deliberation and meeting with smart people and advocates and people who have been impacted by the war on drugs, or by addiction, or by their family not being able to recover despite many attempts, to sort of influence us about what it is we should attempt to do or try. So we are deep in the throes of trying to figure that out right now, because we know, I walk around, I live in inner Southeast Portland. I see what we're dealing with. And it's in other parts of our states too. If you drive to Salem or Corvallis or Eugene, you'll see it as well. And so anyhow, that's part of this. But my worry is that we have, at least right now, about an extra $700 million that we can spend on different things that we didn't budget for when the session ended in June. And I'm worried that we won't make enough of that extra money available to the resources, whether we make something a misdemeanor again or not, to sort of meet the moment. That's my biggest fear. I actually think we need to double the services the money that we're spending on ballot measure 110 supports.
Thanks. And we're gonna go in even more into some treatment in a little bit, and I think that that'll be an important piece to bring up. $700 million. I work in an organization right now who's under the gun to get money out the door. I feel that. Keith, you are an advocate for shelter within the community, within the homeless community. Do you see that Measure 110 is working as intended for our most vulnerable populations of homeless folks? Is it missing the mark for them? And are they an outlier compared to other folks as it relates to Measure 110?
Well, first of all, I appreciate Paige jumping in, and Rob, I'm so frustrated. I just want to start debating and discussing and talking about it. And I want to just address, I know Sergeant Smots and PPA just brought out that poll that dropped this week that showed 68% of my neighbors want to move if they could. This is a visceral moment for us. And so what's the mark, Eric? The question is okay, are we missing the mark? So what's the mark? So first of all, we know that in Portugal and the Netherlands, based on what we know, 80% of the people that are assigned a citation or open drug use or whatever the case may be, their law enforcement will go through an actual drug assessment. They'll actually participate with a dissuasion committee, and they'll actively participate in what's the next step. Yes, they have addiction. Yes, they have some people that don't show up, but it's only a small fraction. In Oregon, it's 1%. So is that our mark? Is it just getting somebody to show up so we can address treatment, drug assessment? Paige hit it at the top of the meeting. What's the mark? If West Virginia is at 90 fatalities for every 100,000 souls, and Oregon's at 27, but the
I think
US
we're a little higher now, but keep going. Yeah.
right, yeah, exactly. Oregon's last number is 27, but the US is at 32. So by that measure, it looks like we're doing okay. But if we look at Multnomah County, where Shelter Portland's focused, we're 63. So I would hazard to say that our mark in Multnomah County is we're woefully harming our community because of inaction. And that community is unsheltered souls. Did they become unsheltered because of drug addiction, or did Measure 110 and drug addiction create the unsheltered? It doesn't matter. It's both. We've got to solve for both.
And Keith, do you think that those referrals or access to treatment is easier when our homeless folks at least have access to shelter? It may not be permanent supportive housing, but is shelter a key factor in accessing treatment?
It's so look at our shelter. The primary sheltering that we have is low barrier. In other words, it's not clean and sober. And that's essentially a move we made in 2016. We moved all of our shelters from nighttime shelters. Some were clean and sober, some required engagement or sobriety. And we moved them all to low barrier, where we had a variety of several in nighttime. And in that period of time, since 2016, our unsheltered rate has increased from less than 2,000 to 4,000 now, 136% increase, one of the highest increases in the United States. So, Eric, right now, it's 2 to 4 weeks to get a reservation, to get a bed in a shelter. So if I'm at that moment where I've just overdosed or I'm actively doing drugs and I've reached my bottom, I want off the cycle. To go into a shelter system and say, we need you to wait 2 weeks, that moment with clarity is past. The individual oftentimes is afflicted because of their drug addiction. We have to set up a more immediate triage approach where if somebody's ready for that moment of clarity, we're there to help them with a resource to address that, whether it's drug treatment, but sheltering to me is that most important unmet basic need in the Portland community that we have to address among all the crises we have. Yes, the lack of high barrier is important because, last point. We know Hooper Detox is right in the center of the city. And several years ago, 80% of the souls who finished it were released to homelessness. How does somebody who's asking for help be released to homelessness? At least now it's between 20 and 50%. But without a high barrier location for someone to go that's clean and sober, and we're asking somebody to go wait in a low barrier where individuals are actively in their addiction, I just think that is malfeasance on our Portland part of helping our community move that step when they want to recover.
Thanks, Keith. You talk about that moment, that moment of clarity, and I want to move to Mike Marshall. You introduced yourself as somebody who is in recovery, and I've seen you at many a board meeting in our community. You lead a community. You're an active voice in recovery in the community across the state. Not speaking, for or against 110. You're a leader in the recovery community. You were an opponent of 110 at the time, but just speaking in terms of, from your perspective, what parts of Measure 110 have gone as they were intended? And can you think about, is it helping people individually? Is it helping our broader community? And is it helping the state overall?
So yes and no. There are three parts of Measure 110, and let me run through this real quick. But first, let me just say that a key part of sort of the science of recovery is that people respond to consequences, and each of us have different consequences, and we respond to different ones. For me, it was the loss of my family, the loss of my career, the loss of almost the loss of my housing, and ultimately the loss of my personal integrity, right? And so that was enough that one morning I woke up and decided to go into treatment. The reason we opposed Measure 110 was it took away the intervention system, the serious consequence, which was a misdemeanor charge, which honestly, Oregon in 20 years has not put anyone in jail for a misdemeanor charge of possession. Anyone who's jailed or talks about how Measure 110 kept them from being jailed, it's not really true. They were generally jailed because of breaking and entering, a check kiting, whatever, all the symptoms that go with our addiction. And so the three parts of it are to stop arresting Black and brown, disproportionately arresting Black and brown people. The second part was developing a new intervention system, the ticketing system with services. And the third part was funding non-Medicaid funded services like peer support services, harm reduction, housing, job training, hugely important things. On the first part, absolute success. The percentage of people of color who have been arrested as a consequence of possession has gone down by like 90%. So, and that was really the intention of the Drug Policy Alliance. It was their only intention. As Paige said, they then layered on these other things in order to get the voters to approve it. The second part is the intervention system, this ticketing system. And I would say that we don't know, that's not working. However, to Keith's point that only 1%, the fact is it's never been enforced. And with all due respect to Aaron, the police across the state simply haven't written those tickets and not confiscated the drugs from the people who they gave those tickets to. And I think that when you look at Portugal and you look at Amsterdam and other places they've done this, drug confiscation, regardless of whether you arrest the person at the time, is hugely important. It interrupts the use right at that moment, which often will prevent a drug overdose, and it increases the street price of drugs, hugely important. And it incentivizes people to want to pursue treatment. Now, so what I think that I didn't appreciate about Measure 110 at the time and appreciate now is it created a new level of consequence that wasn't a misdemeanor charge that can follow you through life. But it was a civil consequence. It has no teeth behind it. So Oregon Recovers has proposed that we figure out how to increase the staggered increase with each ticket you get and go unresponded to, that there's an increased consequence. And then if you get 5 of them or 4 of them, whatever the magic number is, that it converts then to a misdemeanor, but that misdemeanor charge be linked to rapid expungement so that particularly people of color who are getting these misdemeanor charges are not spending the rest of their life paying for that, right? That as they pursue recovery, as they make progress, they're rewarded with it going away, but not go immediately back to a misdemeanor charge. Our courts can't handle it. But more importantly, from the point of view of helping people get into recovery, let's not go from a 0 to 100. Let's stagger consequences. The third part is the funding of these services, which has been hugely successful, delayed, but the Miracles Club here in Portland has struggled for years to help the African-American community. They're doing extraordinary things now with Measure 110 money. We see Painted Horse Recovery. We see the Recovery Cafe down in Medford. There's a new peer service organization in Eugene where there wasn't one before. the harm reduction work that's going on is really important. Unfortunately, all too often it's being linked explicitly to the concepts around disease harm reduction. So making it safe to use drugs so you don't get Hep C or get HIV, hugely important. But the safest form of harm reduction is abstinence. It's not using it all. And so we proposed in our 12-step plan that all publicly funded harm reduction programs have to be linked to a protocol that encourages people to begin to reduce their use and ultimately get into abstinence-based recovery. Not everyone will, but it should be public policy to drive people in that direction. Meet them where they're at, just don't leave them there. So from those three perspectives, number one, yes, it was successful because we're not arresting people of color. Number two, it's hard to say about whether the intervention system is good or bad because it's not being implemented in a meaningful way. And number three, the funding of organizations, to Rep. Nosa's point, has been really successful, but we need to expand those resources so that we can take what we've invested in and have them all grow and expand to the counties where those services still don't exist despite Measure 110.
Thanks, Mike. You bring up some law enforcement related aspects here, and I want to move to Aaron. And look at that, Aaron's even got a smile on his face and a hand up. So Aaron, from your perspective, as a police officer, as a person who represents hundreds of police officers, how has Measure 110 changed the work, police work, and what impacts have you seen that those changes have on the work?
Sure. If I can
first respond as you need to Mike.
Before I answer that, I do want to address the confiscation issue because it is something I hear an awful lot. And Mike, I don't mean to offer this as a rebuttal, other than it's going to sound an awful lot like a rebuttal. So the problem with drug confiscation in the world that we're in right now, especially with fentanyl, if you look at the size of drug busts that we're having. So when my dad was a drug cop for the first 20 years of my life. He was the marijuana drug task force guy. And I mean, in the first 10 years I was a police officer, if a street cop were to get an ounce of some kind of narcotic, you're like paraded through the precinct. Great job. You got this thing. I was talking to someone in Old Town who told me they found a pound of fentanyl in a bush in front of their business the other day. Many of these busts we're seeing are, 5, 10, 15 million user doses of fentanyl that we're finding in cars and other things. And so the real challenge with mass proliferation is, again, from a bandwidth standpoint, it is so cheap and so available that the market negation is actually going to come from the cartels, which is really dangerous. You look at, so initially fentanyl, when it comes into an area, it usually comes as an adulterant, and then it becomes a drug of choice. And I'm being told by a lot of our interdiction folks that cocaine is re-entering the Portland market at a different price point, specifically because heroin was how a lot of the cartels made money. But now cocaine is the kind of sort of similar in price, but it's being adulterated again. So now we're seeing a huge spike in unexpected overdoses where people are taking a substance they don't believe to be fentanyl, but they're overdosing on fentanyl. And so the market adjustment is actually super dangerous, but the mass proliferation makes confiscation really difficult. And the other piece of it is in Portland, our staffing is a challenge. And again, I don't mean it as an excuse, but it is. And with all of the issues we've had with violence and everything else, a lot of our DVD team, which used to be our drug and violence team, which used to be 44 people when my dad was on it, is 3 currently. And so they're focusing a lot on overdose investigations, but it really is a big challenge. So I 100% conceptually agree that if we can interrupt that cycle, it's important. But I also, talking to a lot of my treatment friends, when I was in Portugal talking to folks about what we see in Portland, I was told that that abstinence is a goal that is probably not one we're going to meet. And we also need to recognize that in that world, we need to keep people alive until they're ready to get to treatment. So that's kind of one bucket. B, we definitely should confiscate, which again, if A is true, B becomes complicated. And lastly, you see one suggestion of safe use sites or other things similar, which again gets us back away from abstinence and more into where we really just need to keep people alive. And so from my perspective, law enforcement's role in confiscation is very complicated.
So Aaron, I want to go a little bit, I want to make sure we're being clear. And I think the point you're making is I'll speak from just for myself, right? As a person who was at one time in high school and at one time in college, and at one time where I saw a police officer take a friend's beer and pour it out instead of writing a ticket, but he poured it out on the lawn because that person was underage and shouldn't have been drinking. What you're saying is that if that situation, if that student had needed that alcohol to even live through the next few hours or not go into deep withdrawals, that maybe we would have to question that practice. So I think
I'm not questioning the practice. I'm just telling you how I'm trying to navigate the different inputs I get. But the other thing that I will tell you about confiscation, what you're describing as common practice, it's also kind of dubiously constitutional because that beer is personal property.
Yeah.
And so we can't just take people's stuff. And so you have to have some kind of court surrounding to it. Now, talking to our bike guys downtown, if they come up to somebody and they're using and they're going to give them a citation, they will confiscate those drugs. But just walking around saying, hey, I think you might have some fentanyl, we got to get into people's pockets to do that. You got to search them, potentially use force. And so again, this is where it's a confounding factor for me, trying to figure out what is the level of government intervention we're asking for. I'm kind of all in for all of it, but we just got to make sure we know what we're asking people to do.
Eric, can I just respond real quick?
Yeah,
please. Yeah.
And so, Aaron, I want to push back a little bit on that's not their stuff. It's contraband. Measure 110 decriminalized possession of meth and fentanyl and heroin. However, it did not legalize those substances. So they remain illegal substances. They are contraband. And
if discovered, yeah, but you have to get to it, right?
But if we're talking about, the legislature is probably going to, in order for the cities to be able to, the cities believe that in order to ban open use, that they need to have the legislature act, when in fact, if you see someone using openly, you can just take their drugs from them, correct?
Pursuant to a criminal investigation, if you can do a criminal investigation, but you can't, again, so again, we're talking about violations. The other piece of it too is if you have a criminal, you can search incident to arrest. You can't search incident to violation. And so,
but if you see contraband openly on the street, you have an obligation to pick it up and take it away, don't you?
The officers are doing that every day. If officers in downtown Portland, when they are driving around, especially the bike officers, and I talk to them all the time, if they see someone doing something and they can abate, they do. But again, if you're talking about, again, a hugely prolific problem with a handful of police officers. So again, I'm not saying that it's not something that we can do in part. I'm just saying that it's not a panacea.
And it's just not going to be enough. The availability of the product is so huge. Aaron described the amounts that are being caught on a regular basis. That doesn't count. Just think about, that's the tip of the iceberg. So you take it from me 1 minute, I go walk around the corner and get it new the next.
But that's hugely important, Paige. I think that people have limited resources that are on the street, or most people using are not on the street, right? And so they have limited financial resources, regardless of how cheap it is. But if that's the other part of this, I totally appreciate,
well, wait, I want to go to the two scenarios you just put up there. So one is people on the street and one is people who are not on the street. So if I'm a user not on the street, like a teenager who can get approached via Snapchat and offered something to help me study and have it delivered to my park, my corner, around somewhere where it's not public, the cops can just never even see that. But then public use, so if you say, okay, we all say public use is banned, that's definitely one of the things we have in the measure. All you have to do is then go in your tent, go in your house, right? It can't just be that one thing.
So
and I'm not against confiscation. It's really important, but it's not going to be, it's not the whole solution.
No, nothing's the whole solution. That is available right this moment.
All right.
Can I answer the question? I apologize. I opened Pandora's box and
so it's good. It's good.
Actually, it's really great. But I do want to, we've talked a little bit about public use and we've talked a little bit about dealers. I want to really specifically, we hear that public use is still illegal. But why does it feel like in practice that those statements they are not true when I walk along the sidewalk? What is
jaywalking is not legal either, and nobody gets punished for it.
Eric, it's because of the things that the police officer said. He explained very well why it feels like it isn't.
Yeah, Aaron, go further on that.
So, I mean, look, so the real challenge with police work in general, and again, especially you get into a world where we're really concerned about disproportionate policing, about different outcomes, about what our role in society is. And again, at the core of Measure 110, that was the original discussion, was how do we ensure that law enforcement is not creating, again, an exacerbation of disproportionate outcomes. Police officers operate on a mandate, and when the mandate becomes unclear, we have to focus on the things where we can be successful, especially in the presence of staffing issues. And again, when Measure 110 entered into the conversation, also we went from about 30 homicides a year to 100 for 2 years in a row. Our shootings went up by 300%, and we lost 160 police officers in a year. And so, again, what's so frustrating to me is I 100% understand where people are coming from when they say, why can't you do something about this or that or whatever else? The mandate became very, very unclear. Do we want to physically intervene? Do we want to intervene by, asking people to stop? In the absence of a clear mandate, it becomes very, very difficult for officers to intervene, especially when you have 40 calls holding. Can I arrest this person? Can I not? Can I move them along? Can I not? It became internally confounding to law enforcement. And so, again, what's so frustrating is in a perfect world, I completely agree that if we had 1,500 police officers and we had the ability to really focus on things and we had a clear legal guideline by which we could intervene, and we weren't daily critiquing every single time the police physically interact with somebody in a really critical way, it's a lot easier. But our officers are asked to do a lot, and they're really, really hyper scrutinized for everything that they do. And I'm not even saying that that's wrong, but it does create a negative kind of incentive structure for approaching a violation. To Paige point, if we had a huge outbreak of jaywalking, because again, the societal impact of jaywalking doesn't come close to the societal impact of fentanyl. But from a governmental interest standpoint, the tool we've been given is a citation. We can't just run up and tackle somebody because they're holding a piece of foil. And again, for me, the biggest thing is that at the lowest level, these folks who are suffering from addiction, the most important thing is to get them to treatment, and to get them help. And so I don't know that I think police are the right tool to navigate that in total. So again, we're a partner. But we're certainly not the panacea to solve the problem. And so this is where having really strong partnerships, and if Measure 110 does anything, if the one thing it does is it kind of reawakens the realization that this is a multidisciplinary problem with multiple kind of facets, and every single person who is accepting tax dollars needs to be comfortable accepting conversation and help from every other person who's exists in that bucket. We pay probably close to $1 billion a year in this state in policing, and a whole bunch of other billions of dollars a year on services. There should be a necessitation that those people interact. We should have real-time bed counts and real-time understanding of what services are available. So anytime any person who is in the ecosystem needs, like, hey, I have a person, they're ready right now, we can pull up a OHSU style bed count and say, okay, there's help right here, right now. It's culturally specific. We're making sure we get people where they need to go. So that is the real frustration for law enforcement.
I'm going to ask you one follow-up here, Aaron, and then I'm going to move to Paige and Rep. Noss on some fixes. But first, this week, Portland Police, and you mentioned it in your comments, but the news covered that you had some behavioral health workers, or maybe it was addictions health workers, that went out with the bike squad. Is that a route to helping the police be maybe a convener of treatment options, or starting that conversation? Is that something we're going to see more of in the Portland Police Bureau, is addictions health workers going with police?
Yeah, so we've talked about with some of the drug policy folks, a pilot in East Precinct. And again, the biggest thing for me is, as expeditiously as possible, having law enforcement having access to other resources is huge, because again, the less time that law enforcement is the point person on these things, the better, because folks, the treatment they need, the services they need, they're going to be from other groups. And I'm seeing a lot more service providers come forward and say, hey, can we participate in that conversation? I've spoken with people who were involved in the deal yesterday. It was hugely productive. There were also some hiccups because, again, people aren't used to interacting with law enforcement. But I think that is the future. Again, multidisciplinary approach, having people bring their work together. That's what we did in the schools. It was hugely useful. You need to have folks who are coming at all these things, interacting with the individual, with their individual needs, having real casework where you can identify the needs of the specific individual. We know who their family is, all of that. And that comes from working together.
Thanks, Aaron. Paige, okay, we've heard some implementation. We've heard, Mike shared with us that there's some big treatment groups have been opening across the state, not just in Portland. The representative shared with us some of the funding challenges, but also just the timelines and the huge amounts. But you're working on some fixes. And can you kind of share with us, are you looking at fixes that are more related to the law enforcement and livability issues that the sergeant just spoke about? Are you talking about funding issues? Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah,
about
sure. We fix and improve is the name of the coalition, because we started out as just a group of citizens who were wondering, who are policy focused. Some of us work internally on policy like Rep. Nose, but some of us work outside like I normally do, which is not directly in the policy space, but I'm driven by policy solutions. So we weren't seeing an urgency. We were getting more concerned. When we did decide, like, there needed to be a push for action more immediately, then we had conversations with experts across the spectrum from all over the state and looked at, okay, what did 110 do that we think needs to be pulled back, either, for at least a period of time, and then what was missing? Because in the beginning, I said the Drug Policy Alliance, their number one goal was simply legalization, and they're not from Oregon. The people who really drove that were not Oregonians. So we're here now. How do we go forward? We can't go back. How do we go forward? So our ballot measure suggestion includes a number of things. And I want to say, second something that Mike said, even though I'm a part of a coalition that has filed a number of ballot measures, we really, really hope that we do not have to take them to the ballot in November. We'd much prefer that the legislature is able to make the fixes and improvements in the February session. We can withdraw the measures and all go on our way, because there are a number of other items that need to be, dealt with in 2024 and beyond. So, but we're talking about giving law enforcement tools. I want to go back to the 4 pillars that I mentioned and that Mike has, I think, maybe referred to. It's prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and enforcement. And you need to have all of those. You need to have all of those pieces, because for some people, prevention is actually the possibility of a ticket. For other people, it's some other reason, and for some people, getting into treatment is the possibility of criminalization. For other people, they're already too far down, or they're so there's no way, if law enforcement comes at them, that's going to be a reason that they change their behavior. So very quickly, we're looking at returning misdemeanor status, because that was something that law enforcement asked. But be very clear, none of us involved in any of this want people to serve time in jail. We are looking for ways for law enforcement to be able to intervene and to create programs like Aaron was talking about, and like we have in places in Oregon, and there are around the country successfully. So if you didn't get a chance to watch the hearing on December 4th that Rob and his colleagues had, that was a great one. And I think 2 weeks before that, there was one with law enforcement assisted diversion. I'm pretty sure that everybody on this call, possibly including the advocate that was absent, would agree that is a system that can work. So our fixes are aimed at allowing a system like that to be able to be in use across Oregon. So return misdemeanor status for use and possession, increase penalties for dealers, producers, users, because we do have this higher level of trafficking happening. Provide funding for diversion, which means I get caught with drugs, using drugs, or essentially like a Dewey process. Provide more money for more people to get into those treatment programs. Also allow people who get picked up for drug-related crimes, petty theft, auto theft, the kinds of things that people do in order to support their habit, allow them to go into diversion. A number of other things, but it's all to create that whole system that is ultimately, in the best possible scenario, this is a complete behavioral health system where when somebody needs help on the street, to Aaron's very good point, people are still going to dial 911. The cops are going to be involved whether we want them to or not, but have then available a robust Portland Street Response or a Cahoots program, or what they do in Lincoln County in rural places where in Lincoln County, they have a navigator who meets the police officer or the sheriff's deputy, and then walks people through the process of hopefully getting them to the point that Mike said, like encouraging people to get to lower their use and eventually to abstinence, because all the experts will tell you the best possible money you can spend is prevention. The keeping people from using them. All right, and then I know I've talked long. I'll stop there.
It's really great. I want to ask, what is you mentioned a lot about diversion, and you said
Yes.
both funding diversion, but also you mentioned law enforcement assisted diversion. Can you help us understand what is the difference between that vision and right now, if I were to have an encounter, I would get a citation, and I guess in my mind, I think of that as one route to a diversionary program. What's the differences here, and what are you aiming for?
It's think of it as more similar to, so the citation is more similar to a jaywalking ticket. That's not at least in my jaywalking ticket or my parking ticket, somebody comes at me for the money eventually, right? And there's an escalating consequence if I don't pay the ticket. With the tickets we're giving out right now on 110, there's nothing. There's no consequence. There's no follow-up. There's no requirement. So, and particularly for people who are suffering from substance use disorder, which means I'm not an experimental user. It's not a one-time thing. I'm hooked. You've got to have more push. And arguably, you're in a disease state. And the experts will tell you that you are not capable of making rational decisions, particularly if you're in the middle of your high on either fentanyl or the synthesized meth that is out there now. You're not capable of making a good choice for yourself. So the law enforcement assisted diversion programs and things like them, sometimes the legal community calls it deflection, which I think actually means you never get charged. You're like, here, go, I could charge you, or you could go to treatment, right? And our great intention and hope is that people will choose the treatment path. And if they don't, we have 3 pathways where you can end up in treatment and eventually automatically expunged. Treatment, and I use the broader definition of treatment, not like the official medical term. It just means anything that is not using. It could be peer support, it could be probation, and you're white knuckling it on your own and passing your drug tests on a regular basis. But hopefully, we know that is not effective. So hopefully it's at least peer support, could be inpatient, could be medically assisted, could be all those things, but anything but jail. But you've got to have the full set of tools: prevention and enforcement, treatment and recovery.
Okay, so going to Representative Nas, getting ready for an upcoming session, and you heard some of the fixes that
notes
out loud. So, Representative, can you tell us, is it going to require a legislative fix? Is it a ballot initiative fix, or
no? I think the legislature is
willing to lead here.
I think the legislature is absolutely going to wrestle with this. Now, I'll throw Paige a little bit of a bone that I think some of my colleagues in leadership would prefer that I not say, is like the pressure of the ballot measure also sort of looms large over this. Okay, but like we would be not doing our due diligence as policymakers and as leaders in this state if we weren't evaluating how this is going anyway. Okay. And I think most people believe it's not going very well. I would argue that part of the reason it doesn't feel like it's going very well is because we have people in the throes of very profound addiction to very debilitating drugs that really addict you, that are living in tents in our parks, on our streets, along ODOT, easeways, and it's very visible and it's not awesome. And so, like, if that was not a thing that we were dealing with, like, there's more addiction in West Virginia, okay? But it's not as in your face as we're experiencing it. And so, like, part of our challenge, I think, is if we're going to, whether we make something a misdemeanor again or not. And I think that is the big open question, okay? Because the rest of the things that Paige listed out, like, can we have more police? Can we have more outreach? Can we put more treatment together? Proper drop-off sites for police to take people that are intoxicated or endangering themselves or seem pretty threatening in public. More housing, diversion funding, dealing with this Boyd Hubble attempt to deal situation, okay, which our appellate court gave to us, all right? And more prevention. Like, those are all the sort of easy things for Democrats to get in and get behind, okay? And it's really about, like, can we find the resources with what we have, given that we're sending $5 billion back in a kicker, okay, to meet the moment, to really do a proper job, okay? And so I think, like, we're going to find some combination of all of that stuff coming out of the February short session. The thing that we're wrestling with right now is the whole, like, do we have to make something a misdemeanor again? Like, if you're using in public, and or if you possess, okay, and I'm going to let Aaron go back to that subject because he explained it way much better than I understood it until just now. I think that's the thing. I'll candidly say that between now and the beginning of February, that the Democrats in charge of your legislature are wrestling with, in the best sense of that word. There's plenty of folks that I listen to, including people on this thing, who think you've got to give law enforcement some sort of tool, some sort of thing to sort of say, this is how you sort of force the issue, create the crisis, make somebody make a choice, have them hit bottom, all the things that people say. And a bunch of other people that I listen to, including folks that are providing ballot measure 110 services, that really believe that, like, if you make it criminal again, it's not gonna help, that forced treatment and criminality isn't what we need in this moment. So I think that's the crux of the issue for a lot of us policymakers.
Thank you. Keith, I want to shift over a little bit to you, and you've heard some of these fixes, and some of this conversation has, I think, based on the experience in Portland, sometimes we will either talk about an issue as it relates to the housed population, and sometimes we'll talk about it as it relates to the unhoused population. I'm curious, after hearing some of these fixes, and as an advocate for shelter and a population in Portland who's living outside, how do some of these fix ideas land on you? What are you hearing when you hear Paige and Representative Noss describe those fixes and potential fixes? How do you think that'll affect your group?
Well, thank you, Eric. It's important, and I really wanted to jump in while Representative and Aaron were there, and I'm going to do that as a sidebar, so it's hard not to jump on. So first of all, thank you, Representative. I've seen you in a meeting every other day, and really, Aaron, that goes for you too as well. You guys are jumping in, and I appreciate that. It's a lot of work. Representative, I sent you an email, I think a week ago, you and Senator Lieber, and I invited you at the request of the mayor of Amsterdam, the mayor of Milan.
I can't take every
I get it.
I'm offered, so I apologize. I turned you down.
No, I get it. And the flip side of that was, we keep talking about Portugal, we keep talking about Oregon, and we know we're failing in Oregon. And we keep comparing ourselves to Portugal, but there's another item there about drug decriminalization of programs. In fact, Netherlands is as old as to Portugal. And here's the thing that I'd like to just offer you, Aaron and Paige. You talked about LEAD, law enforcement assisted diversion. So the officers in Netherlands have the ability, if they see open drug use, to immediately detain that person. They have misdemeanor, we call it a misdemeanor. They have the ability to detain without arrest. Call it what you will, but the officer can engage because it's an unsafe behavior. Now, it's what the officer does that's really unique in the Netherlands. If it's less than a half a gram, they just take the name, they take the drugs, and they release the person with a notice, hey, this is going to cycle into potential negative consequences. The officer participates in that person's intervention, but doesn't do anything other than release them. Now, if the officer, because they have the ability to check the amount, if it's 0.5 to 5 grams, that person receives a misdemeanor. But the drugs are confiscated because they're deadly. 5 grams or more, they're arrested. And they go down that route that, Aaron, you know, we have a very distinct and discrete route here too. So Eric, to answer your question, is it, you know, we keep talking about Portugal. We know Oregon's not working. We look at lead to what Paige had said, crystal clear. We need the officer to have the ability to check the amount to determine what the outcome is going to be, but we have to do something. We can't not engage in an unsafe, deadly situation. I hope that answered your question, Eric.
Yeah, and I see that Paige has a hand up. I want to give you a chance, Paige. Do you want to comment in terms
Just
of
a quick thing on there's some confusion about mandatory / forced treatment. Nobody gets forced treatment. Even if you're in lockup, nobody can make you change. You have to change yourself. So we say mandatory as in an intervention in what Keith was just describing, right? Like, here are your choices. And I think, you know, I can't speak for everyone, but we've had some of these conversations in our coalition, and the graduated consequences so that you very quickly go from, look, this is basically a warning, to the next time your choice is a criminal citation or treatment, which means staying sober for a period of time through multiple channels probably. So I just wanted, it said a lot that, you know, forced and mandatory treatment doesn't work. I agree, but a person has to choose, but you also have to give the person option after option after option when they are in the throes of really strong addiction. You can't just leave them to choose for themselves at a time when they're not capable of making good choices for themselves.
you know, there's a question that somebody asked in the Q&A, and Aaron, I want to know what your thoughts are. In a world where we were to make use and possession a misdemeanor again, you know, in Multnomah County, and I think I'm accurate when I say this, is that it's very likely that even if a person was arrested, they'd be released within minutes or hours in the jail. And so what is the point then for a misdemeanor charge? How would that actually help?
So, I mean, a lot of what has been said kind of encapsulates this reality. You know, I think it was Keith was pointing out that when people get out of detox, very often they're just kind of sent back to where they were. Or in many cases, if you let's say you are someone who are suffering from addiction in East County, and you were taken downtown, and you're let out at 2 a.m. in downtown, and you have no way to get home, but you are in the place where drugs are really available. This is really complicated, but so I think the back end piece of it matters quite a bit, making sure that within the addiction space, that if we are taking people into custody, that when that release occurs, that it is to something, that it is for something, that there is some kind of back end treatment there. The reality is that the benefit of having a crime, it gives us the ability to search people. If you want us to really truly abate, I mean, and it could be that they have a lot more narcotics with them, that there's other things going on. And again, at the end of the day, what's the mandate? I'll keep saying this. I really feel like when people are asking law enforcement to intervene in other places, you're talking about Portugal or, you know, other countries, their constitution is different. The legal authority their police have is different. Most of their police are nationalized, and the rules are, it's a country, right? So no matter where you are, the rules are the same. We have 50 country states in America, basically, who all have different rules, you know, and so it becomes very complicated. If you go and do something in a different state, maybe the rules are different. A lot of the people, and, you know, another thing to bring up in Portugal, you know, Porto talked quite a bit about how people come to Porto to use their safe use at our other site or other things. So when we have cities like Portland that might have more resources, you're going to attract people, and you want to make sure your services are there. So anyway, at the end of the day, a misdemeanor crime gives tools to law enforcement to abate. But again, our role truly is to abate. And the one thing that we need to add is that warm handoff. If the goal is, if we've decided that someone is to a point, if our society decides they're to a point where that person, they need kind of a nudge in the right direction, having it be criminal, having it be something that police can detain them for, it really sets the level of concern we have for it. It says where we can take that person. And then on the back end, I mean, one of my friends who came with me to Portugal as well, she talked about her own lived experience, specifically being that she actually turned herself in to go to jail specifically so she could sober up. And she brought her prescription for Suboxone. And then the jail wouldn't allow her to take it because they said they didn't give it there. So again, making sure that our systems are set up to allow as wide a pathway as possible towards sober, right? Towards
That's
getting
a good
healthy.
transition. I want to shift, and we've talked a lot about public use and that livability aspect. I want to shift though to Mike, and I just want to apologize to the group. I mentioned Monta earlier, and I failed to know that Monta is a man, and I said that they were a she, and I apologize for that. We had not met each other, so apologies, Monta. I hope you are feeling better. But I would ask Monta and Mike this question if they were there. But Mike, what do you envision as necessary for Portland and for the state within the community, whether it's private, nonprofit, or government funded, to be able to get everyone treatment that wants it and needs it? And how will Measure 110 help us get to that vision for treatment?
Right. So we have to allow Measure 110 funds to be used to fund treatment beds and detox beds, and a third category of care that we really don't have, but stabilization or respite or whatever you want to say. The big challenge we have that everyone's talked about is the acuity, the severity of this drug supply. And what you have are people that are overdosing on fentanyl and being brought back to life with Narcan. In the course of doing that, they experience a brain injury. And the same is true often when people use this new meth. It's been around for 10 years. It's not really new, but it's different than the meth I used to use 16 years ago. And it has people go into a psychosis to the extent that I've seen people who have been in treatment for 28 days come out and they are still somewhat psychotic from it. And it may be permanent, but more likely it's not. They just need more time. And the challenge is if we had enough detox beds, which we don't have, we turn away 50% of everyone who shows up at Hooper and Fora, the two main detox facilities in Multnomah County, half of whom are there for alcohol detox, but we turn people away. But let's say they get into detox, the chemicals are out of their system, but they are in no place to participate in treatment or to go into housing, their own housing, right? And so what you're seeing at Central City Concern, if they do turn somebody into housing, that housing is destroyed pretty quickly, or it turns into the people using again. And so that's a huge challenge. So what we need as a consequence of this drug supply is a new level of care, that stabilization, respite, call whatever you want, where someone comes out of detox and it's a safe space for them to be for a week, 4 weeks, or whatever, before they go to recovery housing and outpatient, or they go to residential treatment, both of which are efficacious, but till they can start to participate in their own wellness. That's a huge challenge because people are there a week and they might decide they want to leave. And so do we make it compulsory? I don't think so. I think at the moment we have to focus on the fact that we're turning 50% of the people away who are at the front end of this continuum of care, which then has consequences all the way through. So the state, I believe, just needs to meet what the OHSU did a gap analysis last year. They identified county by county the number of treatment beds and the number of detox beds were lacking. Let's just fund them, make them no barrier, so that the police can drive someone to a detox facility and leave them there. Let's create a sobering facility for people who don't want to go to detox but want some respite. But more importantly, let's invest our resources in no barrier access to detox and then treatment. Right now, you can go to Hooper and they don't have a treatment bed for you somewhere. So they're either putting you in transitional housing where people might be using because it's a harm reduction modality, or they're putting you back in the shelter system, as Keith said. totally waste of taxpayer money. More importantly, truly harming those people. We need to, if you're going through detox, you're automatically guaranteed a residential treatment bed. And then housing is treatment as well. And we need to invest in recovery housing. Housing first is an important policy, but abstinence-based housing is hugely important for people that are pursuing recovery. And we have about 20 organizations. Monta, who's not on the call today, is one of the largest recovery housing providers. And they have the ability to open a house in 90 days, right? They know how to do it. They're not tall buildings like Central City Concern has. Instead, they're housing 15 to 18 people with a house manager. They're certified by the Mental Health and Addiction Certification Board of Oregon. We can very quickly, the legislature could very quickly allocate money to those nonprofit and for-profit entities, and we could triple and quadruple the number of recovery beds, housing beds in the next year, and link it then. What we also need is more, not just residential treatment beds, but outpatient beds as well. And I was with Devarshi, who's the new CEO of Fora Health yesterday, and he said if he was spending $100 million, he wouldn't put it into residential treatment, which is what his business does, but instead put it into intensive, really well managed intensive outpatient and housing. And that's where we're gonna get the biggest bang for our buck.
So Mike, that's one heck of a continuum you just described, what I think is really helpful. But to give some context here, are we, and we'll stick with Multnomah County for now in the Portland community. Are we talking dozens of new beds? Are we talking hundreds of new beds? Are we talking thousands of new beds across that continuum of sobering, detoxing, and stabilization treatment, and then to housing? What's it going to take for me as a friend who maybe has somebody in my family who's ready to seek treatment to not get 50% denial rates at the door when I'm trying to seek treatment?
Right. And bear in mind, 50% is based on people knowing you don't have a good chance of getting in. So I would say, hundreds of beds in Multnomah County, at least in the short term, to get ahead of this backlog we've created. And that is the challenge, Eric, in that, the legislature can allocate funds, the Oregon Health Authority can then administer them, they can be distributed. That's a really long process. And we're in a critical emergency right now. And so we need to respond to this at the level that it is and in the manner that we did with COVID, for example. If you can remember, the governor called up the National Guard and set up 2 field hospitals when there was real concern that we would not have enough ICU beds at the outset of COVID. We didn't use most of those beds, but we need to be thinking that way. And there aren't state agencies or government agencies that are designed to move that fast. And that's not a criticism, that's just the nature. And so we have to figure out, working at the county level perhaps, how to have a more urgent, maybe temporary solution of certainly detox and stabilization. Recovery housing can be done really equally quickly, working with the existing providers and just, and maybe facilitating some zoning issues or helping with getting neighborhoods to agree to have housing in their neighborhood and things like that. The governor's declaring, and I believe the mayor's declaring, a state of emergency. That should streamline some of that. But yes, I think we need hundreds of detox beds, that many more residential treatment beds, certainly that many sober housing beds. And as I said, we need to figure out this concept of stabilization and sobering and where the border is between those two things. But that should happen rapidly.
Now, even more than a year ago, we were reading a lot, and I think that unless you were directly involved with OHA or with a treatment provider, it was a little hard to understand. But there was a delay in getting dollars out and into the community, and you kind of alluded to that earlier. There was some initial hiccups, and I'm using that word politely, I think, but it was really it got a lot of attention. Are dollars now getting to the community in a rapid enough pace that we have a chance to actually increase in some of those numbers? You noted a number of new providers or new places in your comments earlier. What are your thoughts now about that process?
So, the money for this biennium was allocated finally, and the checks got out the door last fall. Effectively, we're looking at what the next biennium looks like. The challenge here is We haven't really talked about funding, and Rep. Nose did refer to it, of having a big bucket of one-time money, perhaps, but the Measure 110 bank account is funded exclusively by cannabis tax revenue, almost exclusively. There's some savings that is coming out of the justice system as a consequence, but I don't believe it's that
It's
meaningful.
not that much.
But cannabis prices have fallen dramatically, and we tax cannabis as a percentage of price, and therefore you're going to see in the next biennium a reduction of money as a consequence coming out of the cannabis industry. We need to, and Page's ballot measure doesn't, it rightfully says we should expand what Measure 110 can be spent on in terms of treatment beds and detox beds and prevention. However, it doesn't really make the pie any bigger. So if you're going to allow,
No, it does. We did put a floor. We did put a floor where it can't go below. But I agree, it doesn't make the pie bigger. And to Rep. Nose's point, we need more funding anyway.
and I think there's a simple solution to that, which is we currently tax beer and tax revenue, and we have a distilled bottle fee. So we generate money from alcohol. It gets distributed through this arcane formula, cities, counties, but a bunch of it goes into the general fund. Over half of it goes into the general fund. Let's just take at least half of that, if not all of it, and allocate it to the Measure 110 fund. It is a flat fee-based allocation, so it's a really stable amount of money. It will help stabilize the Measure 110 funds. It will connect alcohol, which is the driver behind the addiction crisis, and it's the reason most treatment providers will tell you that more than 50% of the people in their treatment beds right now are there for alcohol addiction, not fentanyl or meth. So linking alcohol into it will stabilize that bank account. Doesn't impact the alcohol industry in any way. It does create a deficit in the general fund, but as we heard, we're looking at a $700 million increase in that fund. So you can backfill it with that. But by stabilizing that fund and linking it to actually a substance that's driving this crisis in the long term is the responsible thing to do.
So, Eric, just to be clear, the money is out the door. And the viewers can go to an OHA website. You can just Google Oregon Health Authority ballot measure 110, and you can track the amount of money that's gone out and who's getting it. The website is pretty interactive and pretty useful, I would argue. Mike makes an interesting point. I would just say that every dollar that the legislature spends is hard fought and negotiated over. And while I sort of understand his point about there's a nexus between alcohol taxes and having some of those alcohol taxes clearly designated toward addiction and treatment and harm that those products cause people in our community, it's easier said than done. Who knows what the 2025 biennium will look like? I would just say stay tuned about that.
Great, thank you.
Lots of other people want to spend that $700 million extra dollars on other things too. It's not just
right.
Though this topic is pretty high on the list.
Great, and I'm going to ask for this next question that our panelists. I'm going to pose this question, and if you're interested in answering it, I'd like you to just use the raised hand button at the bottom there. So
all right, bookmark me. I'm going to take my hand back down. I wanted to be sure another topic gets in here. So I'll lower my hand for this.
So here's the question. What does compelled treatment or secured residential treatment mean to you? And is it something that our community needs to invest in? And what would it take to increase the number of people who have to go into compelled treatment? Aaron's first. We'll give it Aaron.
I didn't know if it was like one of those game show things where you quickly answer, but I wasn't actually ready to answer. I'm just joking. I think our absolute number one focus, and actually one of the questioners asked earlier, the fact that we have waiting lists is obscene. And frankly, every meeting I go to when there's people who are service providers, like I was one the other day, and Teen Challenge and Esticate, it was like, we have 5 beds available today. If you're within a stone's throw of Portland and we have available beds, we got to find out ways to fill all those beds and get people help that are ready to get help today. So that is just one piece. But B, there certainly are people who are in such a deep state of addiction that need help and need help in a way that they're probably not going to be able to find it for themselves. And so, to me, the reality of compelled treatment, just like any other restorative process, when you have someone who's engaging in behavior that's harmful to themselves or the community, you just got to find out the best solution for that individual, and also, utilize the resources that exist. So if you are somebody who is so deep in addiction that you are, again, being, revitalized with Narcan multiple times a week, you're just unable to care for yourself, just like within the mental health system. We've got to figure out what a fair and just system is, for getting those people to help, and also ensure that the system doesn't necessitate them being felons at the end of it. Because at the end of the day, if what you're doing is suffering from addiction and there's no other, metastasizing factor there, I think we want to make sure that the health issue that is addiction isn't leading to criminal behavior down the road as a result of people not being able to get jobs and everything else. So police play a role in that. We all play a role in that. We've got to make sure that we build the system, understand what it is before we hit go.
Any others from our panel want to talk about? Representative Nose, please.
Okay, so I feel like one of the challenges we have around this whole discussion around compelled treatment is that, honestly, like if we start compelling people, like one way we talk about this periodically is making it a little easier to civilly commit somebody. That is definitely a thing that is out in the ether, that we might do, in addition to whatever we do is sort of what some people consider compelled treatment, if going to treatment is a consequence as opposed to avoiding jail, which we've talked a little bit about here today. But one of the biggest challenges we have with compelled treatment and secure residential treatment facilities is we just don't have enough people that want to get into this line of work and provide it. So our treatment system, for your listeners, is mostly private sector, not-for-profit organizations, who have stepped up to do this, and county and state government provides them the funding. And I will say the legislature has stepped up and tried to make the pay codes in the Medicaid space more robust. We did a 30% increase in those pay codes to try to attract more people to get into this line of work. And for the viewers that are here, if you want to really nerd out, I suspect that in January, either in the behavioral health committee that I chair or in the joint committee that's dealing with addiction and substance use, we're going to get a report out from the state's behavioral health director about what is the baseline we have of residential treatment and secure residential treatment, and what is it we need to have to actually be more optimal. So sort of going a little deeper on the report that Mr. Marshall talked about with regard to OHSU. But that's one of our challenges. Like, I think we don't make the civil commitment statutes more robust because I think people like us were like, there's actually no way to enforce it. We don't have enough of that. And so the short answer is, if we're going to do that, we have to make it more lucrative. Our system is private sector based. People have to want to get into this line of work, and we have to be able to offer them a reimbursement rate that covers their costs and attracts the workforce to do it.
Mike Marshall.
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, I just want to echo what Rep. Nose said. Like, you need the beds in order to compel people into them, right? And so the business model, as he said, is really what needs to be invested in. And the downside of that is you attract bad players, like we've seen in Florida and Southern California and stuff like that. So we just have to be conscious of that as we make that effort. Number one, and then I want to echo Aaron in terms of, as long as there's a wait list to get into detox and a 4-week list to get into residential treatment, forcing people into treatment doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, that said, I do think there's a difference between people having a choice between going to jail or going to treatment. That's not compelled. That is asking people to be adults and make choices for themselves. And it's sort of the Montessori approach to drug addiction, I suppose. But I think that parents who have adult children who are living in a tent, are ODing consistently on fentanyl, just experiencing brain injury after brain injury, legitimately, or loved ones or neighbors or whoever the case may be, legitimately should have some tools to help the person they love who can't help themselves. So I think we need to have a conversation. We need to begin to have a conversation that's not polarizing around, we have a law, so you're either for it or against it. We have a ballot measure for or against it. But we have to begin to recognize that back when I was using drugs, it was different. I could stop using meth 24 hours later. I could have a reasonable conversation with you. That is not true today. And so what we have to adapt all of our strategies to this changing drug supply. And we shouldn't just try doing it by writing legislation and seeing where it goes. Instead, we need to have some community-based conversations around this. And we shouldn't be afraid of that.
Thanks, Mike. It's interesting to hear how that kind of fits together and how people view different types of treatment. So thank you for sharing that. I want to, a lot of the discussion, you brought up kind of the drugs that are on the street now, Mike, and you brought up, the differences between, I think, some of the things that maybe our memories are of what meth was at a certain point, or our experiences, either people who've used it themselves, been around people who've used it previously, and what we're experiencing today. I'm curious, Aaron, in terms of other crimes, not the drug possession or the drug use, but what other things what is the community experiencing in terms of other types of livability crimes? We used to call it petty crimes. I choose not to use those words anymore, because for a person who's been had their window smashed in multiple times, that's not petty anymore, it's regular. So what about other livability crimes? Are they directly related to the drug use that we're seeing on the streets, or is that something else that we're experiencing in the city?
So one thing that someone said in the question thing earlier about Measure 110, about how a lot of things get lumped into Measure 110 and it kind of becomes like the causal factor of everything. I think very similarly, people will see people engaging in certain conduct and they're like, oh, it's because of this or that or whatever else. The reality is that people suffering from addiction, they enter into a spiral, and very often, depending on their initial resources, their support system, they may be able to navigate. But many of the people that we're seeing that are just so desperate on our streets, they're going to do what they need to do to support that habit. Now, the weird thing with fentanyl is because it's so cheap, the things needed to be done to get that specific high may be financially not so complicated. But it leads to other issues, with specifically the kind of meth that we're seeing now leads to significant psychosis and a lot of the kind of, random assaults or other things we're seeing. But at the end of the day, I just think we need to be careful about, again, causally attaching things that may or may not be attached. We do have a livability issue in Portland. You hear it from people who own businesses, people who are just unable to care for themselves, kind of taking over whole streets and everything else. And it's just a very complicated problem. But crime is and will always be attached to drug use. You have also, violence attached to drug dealers and that kind of thing.
Keith, I want to throw basically the same question to you. You're a business owner, you're a neighborhood leader, you're a person who is working for more shelter for our homeless population. In terms of livability, what are your feelings about that as it relates to 110? Are they connected? Are they correlated? Or should we be cautious to assign one to the other?
So let's talk. We'll talk about livability. We'll talk about Measure 110 from a causal, but then let me kind of put it with the umbrella of unsheltered homelessness. And I'll segue with what Aaron had said. If you're unsheltered, it relates to 50% of all arrests that Aaron and his team are responding to. That's only 4,000 souls on the street. They represent 50% or 5,000 arrests last year. That impacts their response times to somebody like my son who had a hit and run, and it took an hour for the officer to show up, and I'm at the guy's house, right? The response times have doubled in the last several years. Now you throw fuel on the fire with livability, which is the drug addiction, and those individuals are eventually going to get arrested because we don't have any interdiction, no way to stop that cycle down, and then that individual is going to end up in jail. And then we don't have any treatment system for them in jail because the inmate exclusion exemption, where we don't even provide treatment while the fella's in jail. And then they get out, and the livability issues for all of us are impacted over and over and over again. And it plays out before us because the system's just broken. It's that cycle that we see Portland just going downward and downward and downward, and we haven't been able to stop that cycle. And our police are chasing the wrong people. You know, we've criminalized that poverty, and we aren't applying or providing that basic need of just a safe place to sleep at night. Now, if you are in shelter, last year, Aaron's team only arrested 200 souls that were sheltered. So it's a 2% arrest rate. So that's my point. It's like, let's take care of the shelter. Let's provide that basic need. If the addiction is driving it, then we'll be able to help that person, but at least they have a way to jump off of that cycle. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Paige, you've had your hand up for a little bit. Do you want to answer on this one? Is this your other
maybe.
topic I forgot you on?
That's okay. Keith did a great job on this last one. I did the other topic that I wanted to be sure we touched on. You know, Mike said early on, Oregon has the second highest addiction rate in the nation. And I know Rep. Nose maybe said something about how we're lower, you know, we're lower than lots of places, but second highest addiction rate in the nation, that's not
and
winning.
We're 48th or 49th, depending on how you measure it, sometimes even 50th in terms of the availability of mental health and behavioral. Like we rank really badly.
Really badly.
Even with a $1 billion investment.
Yeah, even with $1 billion. And so
not caught up to where we should be.
we have almost the most addicts per capita in the nation. And we now, the thing that I really want to get at is, and what hasn't been centered in this conversation, and it's not a blame thing because what's out there most visible are people who are living on the street, using on the street in the city of Portland. But what's happening outside of downtown Portland, the city of Portland, and every other community in Oregon is teens, kids. And we are now have the fastest growing drug-related death rate for teens in the nation. And that is directly related to these new synthetics and the new realities. And I'm not saying it's not the fault of 110, right? But it's one of the reasons that we are facing new realities, so we need new solutions. And that should be talked about right now.
I think that the normal inclination for youth to experiment with substances is made deadly because of the way that these new substances that are out there and they're combined with those things. Like it's a whole other game change.
It is. And so 110, none of us, I think, I haven't met anybody yet who voted for it, who knew that it would apply to people under the age of 18. And it does. So if Aaron's officers see a kid with a beer, somebody used that example, I think you did, Eric, they could pour it out. They can't do that now with fentanyl. And I'm sure Rob knows this, I didn't know this, but our criminal statutes for people under 18 are tied to adult statutes. And that is causing a real huge problem for kids right now. I say kids because I'm, you know, the people 18 and under could be my children, but that has to be addressed because every one of these, every person under, I don't know, 30 has got a drug dealer in their pocket. They're being approached on Snapchat, social media, Signal, right? You can buy drugs via emoji code. And they can be delivered like a pizza delivery. And so that's got to be talked about as well and addressed as quickly as we can. And it's a whack-a-mole game, but I just think we need to, when we're making these changes, we need to center also what's happening to families, youth, kids and families. And somebody mentioned, Aaron, you mentioned that cocaine is now up on the rise for something's being cut with fentanyl and killing people. And that's where, Retinosis, as you mentioned, like the tendency for kids to experiment. This last year, there were 3 PSU graduates who died the night before their graduation celebrating. And, right. And not addicts, just looking to have fun, didn't say, give me fentanyl. They said, hey, somebody said, I got some extra this or that. And the kids online they're not asking for fentanyl. They're saying, I need something to help me study. I can't concentrate. I'm stressed. That's the other, right now. Yeah. Anyway, I'll stop there. But yeah,
It's actually a perfect segue into kind of our final comments here. In my own work, in my own life in Portland, I feel like every time you dive a little deeper into 110, you can pull out another drawer of things to talk about, whether it's treatment, whether it's today I learned that what you just brought up about kids and their possession. And I've personally tried to be very open about the tendency of youth to try things. I'm glad my tendency was decades ago. I'll just put it that way based on what I've learned. And I think that there is something about that admission to ourselves. My own journey through this has roller coastered since 2020 to today. I want to end, and I just want to say to everybody, thank you for participating. You've been a great panel of passion, of expertise. You've been polite to each other where we agreed and disagreed. And I think that is the route to better community engagement is meaningful conversations like this. So I want to say thank you from the depths of my heart as a citizen and as somebody who's worked with some of you, and some of you are new to me. But I also I've been a panelist myself. I want to give everybody a final minute, the thing you didn't get to say, the thing you want to leave folks with, or you can just say thank you and we'll go to the next one. But I want to give everybody that final minute, and then I'll turn it over to Darlene from Neighbors West Northwest to close us out. So let's start. Paige, you kind of started already on a new topic. I'm going to give you.
Yeah, and I'll be short because I just got, my one thank you to Neighbors Northwest, fellow panelists, everybody, the behind the scenes folks who made this all happen. Second, thank you to the almost 200 people that started out with us, and there's over 100 that are still with us. And that's an impressive way to spend 2 hours close to the holiday. And so my closing remarks is just please get involved, stay involved. The legislature's got legislative days coming up in January. There's lots of opportunity. They're listening. I believe that. And we really want our team, whatever at Fix and Improve, we'd like it all done in the legislature so, we can move forward to Oregon's next challenge. So that's what I will say. Get involved, stay involved. And thank you very much for your time and attention. And be safe and happy holidays.
Thanks, Paige. Let's go to Mike Marshall next.
Yeah, thanks, Eric, and everyone who hosted this and tuned in. I've gotten multiple texts from people watching, so I appreciate that a lot. And I'll just say, I'd urge folks to go to OregonRecovers.org, our website, click on Read Our Plan. I think it demonstrates, or it expresses that Measure 110 is, no matter what fixes we make, is not going to end the addiction crisis. Measure 110 wasn't designed to do that, and so fixing it isn't going to accomplish that. We need a comprehensive set of solutions that I think we spell out in that plan, but certainly, the goal with that was to foster conversation. The other thing I will say is it's the holidays. It's a time when people are under a lot of stress, and alcohol in particular is being made really available, but also you're getting together with old friends and there's Coke and there's whatever drugs. And if you are looking for some support, not necessarily abstinence, but just some support, if you have a family member who is, go to Recovery Network of Oregon, recoverynetworkoforegon.org, recoverynetworkoforegon.org, and it'll list by county. If you plug in your county and what you're looking for, It'll give you access to all kinds of resources. And so, and the final thing I'll just say is recovery is possible for everyone. If you're feeling like you just can't do it, you absolutely can. Reach out to someone in recovery, reach out to someone you care about, even if it's someone in recovery you don't know well. They're there to help. And if you have a family member, don't give up on them. Don't give up on them, especially this holiday season. Everyone can recover, no matter what that means for people. And but nobody can do it alone.
Thanks, Mike. You're a blessing in this state, so appreciate you as a friend and the work you're doing. Keith, final comments?
Eric, thank you very much for your time. And also thank you to Commissioner Brim Edwards. I've had the pleasure of working with her on sobering centers. You know, we have a lot of people working really hard on this, including you and your team. And I know it's not easy in your day job. You know, my drop the mic, walk off the stage is I want to be crystal clear. Doing nothing is not a course of action. We can't hope this is going to go away. Nothing's going to change. My concern is that we try and punt, and I don't want to do it. I agree with Paige. We got to do it through the legislative process because we did measure 110 through the ballot and it was just a yes or no. This has to be a nuanced amendment, discuss, argue, and make it right out of the legislative process. And then it's confiscation. If there's one thing I learned after talking to people in Portugal, if it's in the Netherlands and Oregon's trying to go it alone, we can't do it. They have the ability to confiscate drugs. And if it's a misdemeanor necessary or whatever it is, I just appeal to Rep. Nose and your team. We've got to give the officers the ability to intercede to take a dangerous, deadly drug away from our kids. And that's that kind of final thought. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Keith, and thanks for setting these up. I know you've been on the other side before. Appreciate you joining us tonight. Let's go to Aaron.
You know, I think the biggest thing for me, this is the second one of these I've done in the last couple of days. I think it's so important that we all focus on how we can work together. The biggest thing for me with Measure 110 that was frustrating is I think that you know, we've navigated a lot of ways to pull each other apart, to kind of isolate ourselves in silos, to figure out ways to try to really work on the things we're good at. But we are at kind of an interesting inflection point. I think it's very clear that Portlanders are frustrated. They're tired. They're starting to feel like there is no solution in the offing. And I really think the people on this panel and a lot of the people who are listening are doing a lot of really hard work in our community. And the best way to accelerate that work is to find out where we overlap and how we can partner. So, like I said, the pilot we did yesterday in Central, it was the brainchild of a patrol officer at Central Precinct. And he reached out to some folks, and at the grassroots level, I know because he was my trainee, he didn't even ask for permission. He just did it. But we've got to today and tomorrow and every day that comes afterwards. If you have an idea, but you don't know how to make it work with another organization, reach out to them and say, this is what I want to do. What can you do to help support this work? Instead of calling each other and saying, hey, you should do this. We're all really good at what we do, and let's do it together.
That's great, Aaron. Thanks. I know you have been on a lot of these panels, so thanks for giving that time. You have a couple of day jobs, so thank you. And lastly, I want to go to Representative Rob Nose.
All right. So what I want the viewers to know is hell yes, that the legislature is going to take up these topics and do something about them. I don't want to commit to you just yet what that's going to be. Okay. But we have certainly touched on a range of things that I'm for sure we're going to do some of them, if not all of them, in some form or fashion. We are, trust me, we're very aware that this is top of mind for Oregonians for lots of reasons and in lots of ways. And I would just say, watch very closely what happens in January and in the February session. It's not that hard to get to your politicians in this state. And if you've got a thoughtful idea or a concern or an experience that you want to share, you should just reach out to us.
Thank you, Representative. As one of the more accessible ones and coming to a neighborhood forum on the other side of the river, it is definitely appreciated. And so thanks for always kind of cutting right to the chase on things. To all the participants, the neighbors who joined us, we hope that this was a good event. We hope that we presented information in a fair way. And with that, I want to say thank you to everybody and hand it over to Darlene.
Hi, everybody. This is one of the many forums that we've had in our past. And like many of the forums, some of the questions that I'm getting are, what about the questions that we wrote and that didn't get asked? So I want to say to our panelists, first of all, thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much for all of the information that was shared and how well you educated us a step further into Measure 110. But because there were a lot of questions that you didn't get to answer, what I'd like to say, and there's like 40 different questions in the Q&A, I would like to bring those forward to you and then let you answer those at your convenience, as soon as possible, but at your convenience. You can either choose to do it. I see you, Rob.
So,
Oh my God, I can't take much more
look, I
work.
gotta be honest with you. Okay. Like I get a lot of email. Okay. I get a lot of questions. And so
I know, I hear
that's,
you.
I'm probably not going to get to that. Okay. Like, it's just, that's a lot of work. And here's the other thing I'll just tell you. Okay. When you're upset and I write you a thoughtful email back and I take a half hour and I try really hard to think about what can I write that will make you feel better or give you some window, I have to say most of the time that never lands. I usually get an email back going like, not good enough. And so I've taken to calling people. It just goes way better and it takes as much time as trying to come up with a thoughtful email that doesn't land. And so if any of you are here who are my constituents, yes, you're my voters. And that is my responsibility to represent you. And I will absolutely respond. But like I can't commit to doing a 40 question response. There's just no way. I gotta be honest.
That's the 40 in the Q&A. We have other questions as well. We'll gather them, we'll get them out, and panelists can choose or not choose to participate with that.
Thank you.
If you want to access a copy of this webinar, you can find it at NWNW.org under the news section of our website. It's volunteers that make these events happen. While our panelists may be professionals in what they're discussing, not you, Keith, you're just a caring soul for this city. So, but most of the people that participate in putting in their questions and helping to develop the run of show, Keith and Eric, are all volunteers. And so I want to go hats off to all of the volunteers that helped to put this event together, for all of the volunteers that took the time to write a question, to tell us what your thinking was. I can't tell you if there's going to be next steps that Neighbors West Northwest can take. If you are interested in advocating for any one of the issues that came out or another issue, please contact us. We may not be able to help you to do the work, but what we can help you do is gather resources, help you to develop a plan, and find contacts for you to take the next step. So every time we do one of these forums, it comes back to Neighbors West. Well, what are you going to do about it? Well, ours is not necessarily to do something about it, but ours is necessarily relevant to help you to do something about it. So if there are advocates out there that want to take the next step, please come to us and we will help you to do that. The last thing that I want to say is if you, and this came directly from Vadim, and Vadim is still, I think, with us. Issues related to Measure 110 should be directed also to Senator Kate Lieber and Jason Kopf, who are the chairs of the Joint Committee on Addiction and Public Safety. So they were two individuals that are not on our panel tonight. At least one of them was asked and could not be here with us. So we're going to continue to have these informational forums. They seem to be something that our community is very interested in participating in. And with that, I'm going to say happy holidays, everyone.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you
you,
so
Rob.
Good job,
much.
everybody.
Being a
Happy
neighborhood
holidays.
association leader is not easy.
No. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you all for being here.